you know, better bring your, we used to say, the hard hat to the game, because we're gonna play hard.
Mark Price sits comfortably in the pantheon of guards who defined precision in the modern game. At his age today, you can still see the calm confidence in his voice, the same composure that once carried Cleveland through some of the toughest battles of the late 80s and early 90s. He was never the loudest star, never the flashiest, yet few players embodied efficiency the way he did. 4 All-Star appearances, a spotless shooting form that coaches used as a teaching model, and a reputation as one of the purest free throw shooters ever to touch the league. He wasn't just a shooter. He was the engine of a Cavaliers system built on spacing, timing, and clean execution long before those ideas became fashionable. What most fans never realized is how far Price had to push himself to stay on top. Early knee injuries made several teams doubt he could even last in the league. Instead, he used that doubt to sharpen every edge of his game. His handle became compact and efficient, his release became faster than the defense could react, his pick-and-roll control became the blueprint for an entire era of guards who would follow. But for all the elegance in his style, Price was shaped by resistance. The Cavs lived in the shadow of brutal Eastern Conference showdowns where every night meant facing guards who brought pressure, physicality, and relentless mental challenges. Price never complained. He adjusted, recalibrated, and elevated. And that brings us to the heart of his story. Behind that quiet demeanor lives a competitor who never forgot the opponents, who forced him to grow the players, who demanded his absolute best every single night. And today, at his age, Mark Price names the 5 players he respected the most. Mark Price's journey began in the basketball-rich South, where he grew up in Enid and later became a standout at Georgia Tech. Even in college, his style was unmistakable. He wasn't built on raw athleticism. He was built on craft, a compact dribble that wasted no movement, a shooting form that felt engineered for accuracy, and a mind that processed the floor faster than most defenders could rotate. Georgia Tech trusted him to control tempo, dictate spacing, and strike with perfect timing. By the time Cleveland drafted him, coaches already knew they were getting more than a guard. They were getting an architect. With the Cavaliers, Price became the calm center of a team that relied on discipline and structure. He mastered the pick and roll, created space before space was a concept, and punished defenses that overcommitted. Teammates respected his voice because he never raised it. He simply showed what winning habits looked like. Opponents respected him because every mistake against him carried a cost. Price never needed to be dramatic or loud. His game did the talking, and the opponents who pushed him hardest became the names he carried with him long after the final whistle. Now, we count them down. Number 5 is Isiah Thomas, the pulse of the Detroit Pistons, and one of the toughest matchups Mark Price ever faced. When Cleveland entered the late 80s battles, they didn't just run into a good point guard. They ran straight into a field general who understood every inch of the floor and every weakness in his opponent. Isiah was small in size, but his presence controlled the entire temperature of a game. Detroit played at his rhythm, and he used that control to challenge every guard who dared to match him. For Price, the respect came from how hard Thomas forced him to think. Cleveland depended on Price to initiate their structured, efficient offense, but Thomas made nothing simple. He pressured the dribble without fear, stepped into passing lanes at perfect moments, and manipulated help defenders with subtle fakes and angles. Price prided himself on clean execution. Thomas thrived on making that execution collapse. Their matchups became chess games, not foot races. One wrong read, and Detroit punished Cleveland immediately. But it wasn't only the tactics. Isiah carried an edge. He used pace changes to disrupt rhythm, pushed the ball with fearless bursts, and communicated with teammates in ways that forced opponents to stay alert on every possession. For a guard like Price who valued order, Thomas represented organized chaos. Cleveland could prepare for sets and matchups, but they could never fully prepare for the instinctive feel Thomas had for big moments. There was one game that stayed with Price for years, a tight contest where every possession turned into a duel of patience versus aggression. Price tried to keep the Cavs balanced, but Thomas kept applying pressure until the pace tilted in Detroit's favor. It wasn't the points or assists that left a mark. It was the way Thomas dictated the flow. Price later admitted that facing Isiah taught him how vital emotional control was for a point guard. You couldn't rush. You couldn't panic. You had to stay true to your decisions even when the game around you turned chaotic. Isiah symbolized something important in Price's career. He represented the demands of elite leadership at the highest level. To beat Thomas, you needed precision, toughness, and unwavering focus. And even when Cleveland couldn't always overcome Detroit, Price always recognized the greatness in front of him. That is why Isiah Thomas earns the number 5 spot. Number 4 is John Stockton, the guard whose game mirrored Mark Price's in ways that created a unique blend of respect and challenge. Stockton wasn't a showman, and he didn't rely on flash. He relied on fundamentals sharpened to a level few guards in league history have ever reached. For Price facing, Stockton felt like facing a reflection defined by precision discipline and absolute mastery of the basics. Utah's system magnified Stockton's strengths, with Karl Malone setting some of the heaviest screens in the league and a half-court offense built on clean angles. Stockton operated with surgical control. He attacked small gaps, delivered passes exactly where shooters wanted them, and punished defenses that weren't aligned. Price understood this style deeply because it resembled the way Cleveland relied on him. He felt every decision Stockton made because they came from a similar basketball foundation. When the Cavs played the Jazz, the matchup often looked calm on the surface, but intense underneath. Neither guard wasted movement, neither chased unnecessary flair. Both focused on efficiency and making the most correct read. For Price, Stockton represented the standard of how far a guard could push fundamental basketball. If you slipped even slightly on a rotation or misread a screen, Stockton created an advantage instantly. There was a game in the early 90s that Price always remembered. Cleveland tried switching their coverage against Stockton, hoping to disrupt his timing. The adjustment lasted only a few possessions before Stockton identified the pattern and dismantled it with quick hitters to Malone. Price watched the way Stockton recognized defensive shifts in seconds and understood that this was a different tier of basketball IQ. Through those matchups, Price developed an appreciation for Stockton's discipline. Stockton took hits, absorbed contact, never got rattled, and rarely made poor decisions. He played with a steadiness that elevated everyone around him. Guards who relied on flash struggled against him. Guards who relied on hesitation couldn't shake him. And guards who valued intelligence found themselves in a mirror match they couldn't win without perfection. Price admired Stockton not for dominance but for clarity. Stockton proved that a guard could control a game purely through timing angles and relentlessness. No theatrics, no ego, just mastery. That is why John Stockton stands firmly at number 4 on Mark Price's list. Number 3 is Gary Payton, the guard who turned every possession into a test of mental endurance. For Mark Price, facing Payton was unlike facing anyone else on this list. Thomas challenged your decision-making. Stockton challenged your discipline. Payton challenged your comfort. He took a game that Price preferred to keep orderly and pushed it into a space filled with pressure, noise, and relentless physical presence. Seattle's identity during Payton's prime came from that edge. The Sonics pressed, trapped, and disrupted rhythm better than almost any team of their era. Payton was the tip of that spear. He didn't just guard you, he invaded your space. He closed over screens before they were set. He forced turnovers not by gambling, but by overwhelming ball handlers until they had no room to breathe. For a guard like Price, someone known for his composure, this matchup demanded a different level of toughness. Their battles always began before the first dribble. Payton used his voice to set the tone. He talked to his matchup, talked to referees, talked to teammates, talked to anyone within reach. Price wasn't a talker, but he understood the purpose. Payton was forcing opponents into playing emotionally rather than logically. Price had to ignore the noise, maintain his structure, and execute his reads, even when Payton tried to shatter that structure possession after possession. There was a memorable game where Payton pressured Price full court nearly every trip. It wasn't about steals, it was about attrition. By the fourth quarter, most guards would be worn down. Price stayed poised, using his compact dribble to break traps and get Cleveland into their sets. Later, he would admit that few players demanded that level of concentration for an entire game. Against Payton, every dribble had to be precise, every pivot controlled, every pass protected. What Price respected most wasn't the intensity alone, it was the intelligence behind it. Payton knew when to turn up pressure and when to drop into passing lanes. He understood timing, he understood angles. He used his energy strategically, not recklessly. For all the fire in his personality, his defense was built on calculation. Payton symbolized the emotional toughness required to be an elite guard. You couldn't just play your style, you had to withstand his. You couldn't rely only on shooting and spacing. You had to fight through pace contact and psychological warfare. That is why Gary Payton holds the number 3 spot. Number 2 is Reggie Miller, a player who didn't share Mark Price's position but absolutely shaped the way Price approached shooting, spacing, and late-game execution. Price respected guards who forced him to think. He respected defenders who pressured him, but Reggie was something different. Reggie made you confront the reality that a single mistake, one screen misread, one step late, could flip the game instantly. Indiana's entire identity shifted when Reggie caught fire. His movement never stopped. He curled around screens, flared to the corners, sprinted through traffic, and always resurfaced in the one pocket of space that mattered. For Price, who already understood the importance of efficiency, Reggie represented the final evolution of perimeter impact. He didn't just make shots, he dictated how defenses had to behave. You couldn't relax, you couldn't sag, you couldn't switch lazily. If you did, the scoreboard reminded you in seconds. Cleveland-Indiana matchups were battles of alignment versus chaos. The Cavs relied on structured half-court execution. The Pacers relied on Reggie's gravity to bend shape into something unpredictable. Price had to command Cleveland's offense with total clarity while also processing the way Reggie's movement forced defenders into constant recovery. Even when Price wasn't directly guarding him, he felt Reggie's presence because it changed pacing, spacing, and shot selection at the other end. There was a game in the early 90s where both teams traded long-range runs. Price shot with clinical precision. Reggie responded with wild momentum swings that only he could generate. Price later acknowledged that Reggie's ability to create pressure without the ball was something few players in league history could duplicate. You didn't just defend Reggie, you defended the threat of Reggie. What impressed Price most was how fearless Reggie was in big moments. Late in the fourth, when the gym tightened and every possession carried playoff weight, Reggie didn't shrink, he expanded. He raised his voice, raised his intensity, and raised the game's emotional temperature. Price admired that. He understood how hard it was to maintain accuracy when the world felt like it was closing in. Reggie excelled in exactly those moments. Reggie Miller symbolized the rise of perimeter excellence, the recognition that shooting could control tempo spacing and the psychological shape of a game. For a precision player like Mark Price, Reggie was a mirror from a different angle, the showman version of what elite efficiency looked like. That is why Reggie Miller stands at number 2 on Mark Price's list. Number 1 is MichaelJordan, the opponent who didn't just challenge Mark Price, he redefined what every guard in the Eastern Conference had to become. Price respected many players for different reasons, but Jordan stood alone because he altered the entire landscape. You didn't simply game plan for him. You recalibrated your team's identity around surviving him. Jordan wasn't a point guard yet. He influenced Price more than any guard he ever faced. Cleveland could execute a perfect possession run, clean spacing hit, their timing, and Jordan could erase it all with one sequence. A steal, a transition finish, a mid-range jumper off balance. Suddenly, the Cavs were 2 possessions behind. That pressure forced Price to elevate his efficiency, sharpen his decision-making, and value every trip down the floor as if it were a possession in May. The Cavs-Bulls rivalry carved itself into NBA history through heartbreak, and Price stood directly in its path. The most famous example remains the shot, a moment that Cleveland fans still feel decades later. For Price, it was a lesson in the unforgiving nature of Jordan's presence. You could defend well, you could contest the right way, you could execute your rotations. Jordan still found ways to break your spirit. That level of excellence demanded respect from anyone who truly understood the game. Price studied Jordan from the perspective of a guard who valued precision. He admired how Jordan balanced power and control, how his footwork created angles that didn't exist a second earlier, and how his competitive fire elevated the Bulls in moments that crushed other teams. Jordan forced every opponent, especially point guards, to operate with zero margin for error. Lose your composure and the game shifted instantly. Lose your focus and Chicago ran away with the quarter. There was a particular matchup that stayed with Price, a night when Cleveland executed nearly flawlessly, hit shots, rotated quickly, and communicated with discipline. Yet, Jordan turned the second half into a personal showcase, hitting contested jumpers, slashing through 2 defenders, and controlling the game's emotional tone. Price realized that to contend in the East, you needed not only clean offense, but mental resilience built for storms Jordan created effortlessly. What made Jordan number 1 on Price's list was not dominance alone. It was the complete package. Skill, intelligence, timing, toughness, psychological command. Jordan pushed Price to become more than a shooter, more than a floor general. He pushed him to become a competitor who understood the weight of greatness. That is why MichaelJordan ranks at the very top of Mark Price's 5 most respected opponents. Mark Price's list tells us everything about the era he helped define and the standard he held for greatness. Isiah Thomas challenged his ability to manage chaos. John Stockton tested the limits of pure fundamentals. Gary Payton forced him to stay composed under pressure few guards could survive. Reggie Miller pushed the boundaries of shooting, spacing, and late-game execution. And MichaelJordan, the ultimate measuring stick, demanded excellence every single night. These weren't just opponents. They were the forces that refined his game, shaped his mentality, and sharpened the precision that made him a Cleveland legend. For Price, respect was never about popularity or headlines. It was about who pushed him to evolve. Each of these 5 players represented a different kind of challenge, tactical, physical, psychological, or emotional. And by meeting those challenges year after year, Price built a career defined by craft intelligence and relentless discipline. When fans look back at those Cavaliers teams, they remember the elegance of his shot, the efficiency of his decisions, and the way he commanded the floor without raising his voice. But behind that calm exterior was a competitor shaped by the very best the league had to offer. These were the names he admired most. These were the battles that forged his legacy. And now the question goes to you. Which 5 players do you think Mark Price respected the most during his era?